Dr. Nicholas Wright, MRCP and PhD, is a neuroscientist who researches the brain, technology and security at University College London, Georgetown University, and the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., where he also advises the Pentagon Joint Staff. Nicholas worked as a neurology doctor in London and Oxford and has published numerous academic papers which have been covered by the BBC and the New York Times, amongst others. He's appeared on CNN, BBC, and regularly contributes to outlets like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and Slate. And we have to mention the fantastic book which this conversation is based on. It is called Warhead: How the Brain Shapes War. We will, of course, put links into the description. And, of course, my first question is going to be about the book, why it was written, what the intended impact were, the sources and the inspiration, and so on. Before we jump in, thanks to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and of course everyone who engages with the content itself, sharing it, liking it, and in many instances I know you will share it with friends and relatives to try and increase the reach of the audience, especially at this critical time of, dare I say it, sort of rising authoritarianism globally. I think it's important to get more and more people to tune into hopefully conversations like this that are nuanced and led by expert knowledge. So without further ado, Nicholas, welcome to the channel.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, let's start with the book. I mean, it's got an absolutely brilliant cover. So, congratulations to the publisher there for creating a very, let's say, arresting product. But the content itself is, to my mind at least, very, very stimulating and original. I think some of the questions are going to be unlike any that we've covered on the channel before. What's your inspiration for writing this and the sort of, the source material that drove it as well?
Yeah, well, as you said, so I was a neurology doctor and I was practicing medicine, treating patients, helping out, helping with teams who are doing brain surgery, putting electrodes into awake patients' brains and that type of thing. And then I spent a number of years using functional brain imaging, so that's brain scanning, to look at how humans make decisions about things like rewards and punishments and so on. And I did that at the lab that DeepMind was spun out of, the Research Institute in London, which was just an incredibly exciting hubbub of ideas, enormous, exciting new ideas about how the brain works. And I really wanted to apply those to the real world. And one of the areas I cared about deeply was thinking about applying these to military strategy, to security. And so I then moved to Washington, D.C., where I worked at one of the big think tanks in Washington looking at nuclear weapons and applying these new ideas about how humans really make decisions to help people better understand how to deter others, which is about influencing how they choose to act. Individuals are key to that. Human decision making is key to thinking about nuclear strategy. And then I got to work closely with a wonderful group at the Pentagon Joint Staff, and I've been advising them for the last over a decade now. And this specific book arose because I really wanted to speak not just to experts or people in the Pentagon who think about these things all the time, but to sort of real people in the real world, because I think the world has changed quite radically. And the reason I'll say that is that now we can lose. So, the book opens with a true story when I was sitting in a cozy London pub, maybe not far from where you are now, I don't know, in England. And sitting there with some friends, and they were like, well, doing the usual chat, like, what are you doing? I was like, oh, I'm writing a book about war and the brain. And they said, well, like one of my friends like literally laughed out loud. He said, why writing a book about war on the brain? Because I mean, America has so many amazing machines and planes and guns, tanks and whatever. I mean, if there was a war, there's no way they were going to lose. And even if that, there's not going to be a war. Why would anyone bother invading somewhere like Ukraine or Taiwan, which are a couple of the areas that I raised? And what he didn't realize is that actually, at that point, a lot of recent war games had shown the United States losing over somewhere like Taiwan. People genuinely are really worried about losing in our time. And I wanted to write a book that would reach a general audience and give them not only like what we're learning about the brain, which is really exciting. And bear in mind, those are the same brains with which we live our everyday lives, but that also tells us about how those brains matter in war, why we are driven to war, why every brain is built to win or at least survive a fight. and how we can use that self-knowledge to hopefully avoid wars, and if we must fight a war, to avoid escalation that we don't want, especially at the nuclear level, and also if we have to fight a war, that we can win that war, because the brain has always been the central weapon of war. And I'm optimistic we can do that. And so my slogan, if I have a slogan, is that we can build a more peaceful world through self-knowledge. And that's really what I want to give people in this book, is self-knowledge of us humans as we really are. And that makes me optimistic about the future, and I want other people to be optimistic too.
Well, that triggers a million different questions. But the first one that comes to mind is assumption. I've got a friend who's pretty obsessed with the idea of how the brain makes assumptions and how that ladders up to decision making. And that could be tactical, strategic when you're in a warfare situation. And of course, it could be that your decision making process is built on a number of assumptions, the falsity of which compounds to potentially make the wrong decision. But wars themselves, as we've seen with Ukraine, are replete with assumptions. The assumptions that Putin made based on information he was being given, as well as his own, myth making and imbibing his own propaganda, led him into a war that really didn't make an awful lot of sense if you're setting out to win it. But he didn't go to the idea, that we're going to launch this war and lose it. No, he must have been absolutely convinced that his assumptions were correct and he could win it. But you've also flagged something really interesting there, which is our default assumptions after sort of 60, 70 years of peace, relative peace after the Cold War, no, after the Second World War, rather, that the sort of default values of liberalism, global trade, and this almost endless movement towards less war and more constructive peace. We're layering on all sorts of assumptions, which in hindsight have reduced our ability to conduct deterrence, and now in the full-scale war context of Ukraine, limited our ability to actually imagine victory.
I mean, those are all really powerful observations. So I think, I mean, if you ask the question, why do people say, let's talk about Vladimir Putin. I think there will always be a number of people who, if they can, will deliberately choose to go to war or use violence to achieve their ends. And unfortunately, I think Vladimir Putin is one of those people. And there will always be, this is one of the reasons that humans are driven to war. There will always be a minority of people who will be the next Hitlers, the next Bin Ladens, the next Vladimir Putins, and that's part of what it is. So I think if he had a regret about how things had turned out in the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, I think it was that he didn't do a very good job of invading. I don't think that I think that would be his regret, rather than that, I think he would likely, why did we plan that so badly? And it didn't turn out as we hoped. So I think that's one important point to make. And that's something people often pretend. They like to pretend that there aren't people like that in humanity. And I'm sorry, but there always will be, for a wide variety of reasons. So then about assumptions. So the remarkable thing is that you're absolutely right. We all live with assumptions the whole time. The remarkable thing is, though, is that we can function at all, let alone that we function reasonably well despite all these assumptions. So to give you an example, your brain works on the equivalent wattage, the equivalent power of a dim incandescent light bulb, and that's not because you're particularly, underpowered. But all our brains do, right? Our brains have to simplify the world. They have to operate at many different levels all the time. You can be thinking about what tasks, in the morning you get up, you can be thinking about what tasks you need to perform whilst you're eating your breakfast. You don't have to stop, really think about how to make your breakfast and eat your breakfast, and then get on with thinking about your day, or even thinking about really big issues of the day as you listen to the radio or whatever it might be. So there are so many different systems in our brain, and obviously I describe those in the book. It's like we have an orchestra of different systems in our brain, and all of those systems have to operate in a simple way. They have to reduce the world to something that's manageable. And at the very base, what our brain does is the reason why you have a brain the reason why I have a brain, the reason why every listener or viewer has a brain is actually very simple. You have a brain to take in sensory information and link that to actions that can help you achieve your goals. Right? That's why you have a brain. That's why a mouse has a brain. That's why a fruit fly has a brain. That's why a chimpanzee has a brain. That's why you have a brain. We have an enormously, a remarkable orchestra of brain systems that help us do many different things that can help us achieve that. But that's at base what we're for. Now, one of the incredible things about humanity, which is something that we have, so the book takes a journey through the brain, all the way from the brainstem at the very base, all the way through to the frontal pole, this bit right at the other end. And what the very other end of our brain, the most distinctively human part of the brain can do, is it can think about our own thinking, right? So you can think about your own thinking. And one of the things that we can do that's truly remarkable is exactly the type of thing you were just talking about, question our own assumptions. And really great war leaders, for example, have always done that. Winston Churchill, for example, deliberately chose as his key military leader in World War II, Alan Brooke, he deliberately chose a man who would argue with him, a man with opinions, not a yes man, a man with really strong opinions that he very forcefully put forwards. And that's because often we need our assumptions to be checked, and that can make us better. And that's one of the reasons I think why Vladimir Putin has done a lot worse in this conflict than in many ways he should have done, and Vladimir Zelensky has done better in this conflict than perhaps he should have done.
And it's quite the opposite with Trump, as you say, and Putin. Those that incline more to, let's say, an autocratic or hierarchical kind of system. I mean, not only does it sort of quash innovation. I mean, one of the things that certainly I would associate with Churchill is an extraordinary capacity to open his mind to innovation and allow that to flourish. And as you say, put in charge people who are not, say and show him things that he may instinctively think, well, that's not going to work. Why would we do that? And now these get crushed in more authoritarian systems. I mean, Zelensky probably is Ukrainians would argue is halfway there. If we have figures like Andriy Yermak, his chief of staff, I mean, I've heard the frequent complaint that he's something of a gatekeeper and a blocker on innovation. But then I don't think there is a perfect system and a perfect way of doing this. But to dig into that further, I mean, it seems to me there's a really fascinating angle here, which is if the brain is this machine that helps us to formulate strategic goals and then to marshal resources and sort of group dynamics to achieve those. What is the mode of programming the brain? Because if we listen to Yuval Noah Harari, he puts a huge emphasis on storytelling, on one could almost call it narrative programming that not only combines information, but it creates the kind of the will and the tone and the energy that then allows you to also get behind these kind of goals. And we'll come to that in a minute because it seems that Russia is rather good at tapping into that idea and narrative programming through cognitive warfare. But first, if you could sort of comment on that idea.
So I think that's one small part of how our brains work. And I'm not saying that's not an important part and I think in particular, an important part for how we communicate our ideas and how leaders, for example, communicate ideas or story, people who are trying to tell when I was writing my book, I wanted to make it an interesting story. I wanted there to be a story. I wanted people to travel through the brain, journey through the brain, see how one part led to the next part, that led to the next part, and it was interesting. And then there were also stories about war in there. And I wanted people to tell stories about war, and they remember those stories. So I think stories are part of an important part of how we often how we communicate. But actually, they're only a very small part of how our brains work, and only a small part of what makes us successful as organisms. So I would say that's as a historian, for example, which I think is what he is. That's totally understandable, but that's not really how our brains work. So our brains work in, as I say, so if we start down at the brain stem and then we move all the way through to the frontal pole, and so right down at nearer the base of the brain, for example, you can think about things like the dopamine system, right? And one of the things that we know from the dopamine system, and this is, what people think of as pleasure, and dopamine, hit of dopamine, that's great, whatever, on social media, getting hit of dopamine. That's partly what it is, but there was actually a much more interesting discovery about 25, 30 years ago now, which is that that's not really quite what dopamine signals. So what dopamine actually signals, and this is a general principle across the brain, as we've discovered subsequently, what dopamine actually signals is not just that something's rewarding, but that something is unexpected, that something is surprising, okay? Because our brain has so much information to deal with that it can't just receive information like a passive TV set. What it needs to do is it's constantly making predictions about the world so that we can act. And then when those predictions are wrong, when there's an error, when there's a surprise, when something happens when we're not expecting it, then that prediction error, and we call this prediction error, that makes an event have a bigger impact on you as an individual. And so that's why, for example, things like surprise are used on social media. So Taylor Swift, for example, literally, she wrote a Wall Street Journal article in which she said, what the key thing here is to use surprise to build relationships with people. So she'll like suddenly pop up behind one of her fans, and then she'll start playing the guitar. Surprise is also controlling surprise and minimizing surprises is key for example, the counterinsurgency theories of David Kilcullen, with whom I once gave a talk at DARPA, people who invented the internet, and we were talking about how to influence populations and defend against those who are seeking to sow discord. One of the key ideas, or the key idea of his counterinsurgency work, was about controlling predictions, making a more predictable, ordered world for populations. And of course, as we know, surprise is central to warfare. So if you think, for example, about the Battle of France, right, in May 1940, on May the 10th, 1940, the defenders of France had more trained men, more guns, more tanks, more planes. We had more stuff than the Germans, and our stuff was just as good, if not better, than the Germans' stuff. But what the Germans did is that they were far better at making fast decisions, combining the technology of their time with skill, will, and daring. And they outthought and they surprised key parts of the French government, French military, and they cut through them like a knife through butter. And then, of course, the reason why France collapsed so quickly, and bear in mind it was just over 6 weeks from the launching of that offensive to Hitler's, cavalry clattering up the Champs-Elysees in a victory parade, is that French will to fight collapsed. And again, I think this is partly about the surprise, and I'm not the only person to have articulated a lot of this in order to talk about the surprise. And I think that also raises another key point from what you talked about earlier about authoritarian states versus democracies. Because Hitler's state was, in May 1940, an autocracy, right? It was definitely an authoritarian state. Hitler was not a nice guy. He was a very bad guy. The French and the British were the democracies, flabby liberal democracies, whatever. You can have a whole discussion about how rubbish we are, whatever. But actually, what's very interesting is that although Britain did innovate in the interwar period, the Germans innovated under Hitler far more than the French did, right, in the interwar period. And this is not a contentious issue amongst historians. And so I see and I spend a lot of time thinking and talking with people about China and the Chinese military. The Chinese military are very innovative. Xi Jinping is certainly an authoritarian. The Chinese state is certainly an authoritarian state. And China is very innovative. You just have to look at things like electric vehicle manufacturing or, AI to see how innovative they are. And we're also seeing that in the military sphere. So I wouldn't say it's as simple as authoritarian states are innovative, democracy is innovative, because sadly history and a variety of like modern day examples show that that's not the case.
And that's the impression I always have of Russia, is when the hierarchical process stamps on innovation, there are other things at work there. It's not the default. It's just that system and the way it holds together, happens to lean on highly punitive, let's say, forms of justice and social organization, which is absolutely crushing for trust, coordination, innovation. And that seems to be the key difference with China. And you can't build a complex manufacturing economy if you have the sort of deficit of trust that you see in, say, the Russian system. But what Russia is good at, of course, is this cognitive warfare. And it really, It's quite interesting. I just been transcribing an interview with Ermolenko, who's a key Ukrainian philosopher, and he said there's an interesting thing about the stories we tell each other that may well ladder up then to how we perform or how we group or how we coalesce when we do have to fight. And he was talking specifically about narratives around the Second World War. And I guess if we look at sort of movies and the narratives that are told about people involved up until the sort of maybe late 60s, early 70s, you could tell stories about heroism and you could do it in a completely unironic fashion. And of course, many of the people were still not that old at that point, and so you could tap into those primary sources. It then became the case that the sort of stories we tell about the Second World War, subsequent to that, get influenced by certain dogmas, perhaps, but also distance in time, and they become, I would say, detached somewhat from the individual heroism and the will that was required. So the stories we tend to tell are more abstracted, and it almost becomes embarrassing to use words and phrases such as individual heroism and those personal characteristics, i.e., you can't hold people up. I'm going to say as icons, but the very word hero becomes sort of problematic. But Yarmolica's argument there is this is really difficult because unless you recognize the absolute personal sacrifice and the ability to say, look, this might be a flawed person, but they could achieve extraordinary heroism, it becomes quite difficult to start imagining achieving victory itself. And that seems to be the place where we're at. Whereas Ukrainians do not have such a problem. They've missed out on a couple of decades of that sort of, let's say, revisionism.
Hmm. I think it's a really great point, and I think also let's look at Ukraine, for example. So if you look at Ukraine, had Russia done what it did in 2022, February 2022, had it done that when the little green men went in early mid 2014, then I think things would have been potentially very different. So actually, a lot of the way that Ukraine has managed to do so well, and it required courage. So, for example, outside Kiev early on in 2022, in that war, they were outnumbered 12-1 outside Kyiv. And they were certainly completely outmatched in terms of aircraft, tanks, arm, all the rest of it. And they were very brave. Um, the question of why they had the will to fight then, and I think a lot of people would suggest maybe they wouldn't have necessarily had the will to fight in 2014, was due in part to the fact that Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainian identity had been strengthened after 2014. And that sense of identity, that question answering, who am I, is so important to us humans. It's also to do with training. So a large number of Ukrainians were trained by the Americans, the British, and the Canadians in particular were crucial for providing training, and that training is vital to provide the will to fight. So again, that was really important. Also, we provided some materials for them, but for all of those reasons, they were able to fight then, and they did fight, and that was very powerful. Now, in terms of heroes. I think the vast majority of people never really meet anyone who's been in the military anymore. I don't know anybody. I spend a lot of time, obviously, speaking to people being, in the Pentagon a couple of weeks ago. I meet people for whom I have deep respect because they are fundamentally, obviously, courageous people. And the fact that they are talked about by others who I also respect indicates to me that they are probably, there are things that they would never talk about necessarily. To me, certainly in that type of setting, but they are people whom I deeply respect. They are courageous, the type of people you would follow into a dangerous situation. And I think you're absolutely right that as we become, more polarized, more cynical, we lose some of those heroes. And that is something that we need to counter. Now, that said, we also need to see the bigger picture. And see that other people won't necessarily always see our heroes exactly as we see them. Nobody is perfect. Churchill, for example, who I have a huge amount of respect for, having read so many things about him over the years, still, he wasn't perfect. He made wrong decisions. He did things that were wrong. And so I think we need to see the bigger picture often and take a wiser decision about, what is a hero, what isn't a hero. Can we think that people are courageous? And actually, I think once we start seeing the bigger picture, we can say that there are important, courageous people. And this is the kind of thing we're going to have to, you're absolutely right, going to have to start reinventing. But then if I say one thing that I saw recently, I watched with my son actually, was SAS Rogue Heroes. I mean, literally the clue is in the title there. I mean, those guys are heroes and they come across very well. Perfect, no. But certainly heroes. So I think there are these things in society and we can build on them. And being a bit skeptical is also a good thing because we don't want to be uncritical of these people who have enormous power in our societies.
Absolutely, and that brings on to another interesting issue, isn't it? Of not just why people fight, but what is the reasoning, both strategic and tactical, that causes people to say, okay, well, we're going to go to war against, Joe Bloggs or whatever it is over there. And I think as you sort of talk to people and obviously on this channel, I talk to a lot of people who are going to articulate that in a much more strategic fashion
Mm-hmm.
in the frame of geopolitics and so on. But then when I go and talk to relatives, I realize that there may be some overlap. We may ladder up to the same purpose, but actually the narratives or the justification that's being used may well be very different from people right the way through, the structure that forms an army and a society that forms it. Yes, you go to war, but actually the stories and the narratives are fundamentally different. And what's the onus on leaders to kind of understand that, to translate their geopolitical, strategic, and abstract purposes into a narrative form that actually works for everybody?
I mean, again, and that's a very interesting way to frame the challenge. So I think to some extent, see, leadership, yeah, communication is absolutely central to leadership, but perhaps I can kind of explain a little bit, first of all, why some of the background before I get on to exactly, why leadership is so crucial. Sorry, why communication is so crucial to leadership. Perhaps I could just sort of briefly explain why we have leaders, and in fact, why humans have groups of more than a couple of hundred individuals at all, right? Because humans, no other primates, there is no non-human primate that can form a coherent group of more than a couple of hundred or a few hundred individuals at all. And yet humans, we have the remarkable capacity to create groups of a few thousand individuals, which is something that absolutely no other primate can do. Coherent groups of a few thousand individuals, that's a tribe. Or, tens, hundreds of thousands, millions, right? So we have this incredible capacity. How do we do that? So we do that through what I describe as an identity culture spiral. So our identity, and this involves, we sort of key parts of our brains, our identity is an answer to the question, who am I? Right? It's an answer to the question, who am I? And we create individuals whose identities are coherent enough with each other, they're consistent enough with each other, they can form a coherent group. And that happens partly through culture. So culture, there's obviously a lot of discussion, we can have a long discussion about what culture is and whether it even exists at all and so on. But broadly speaking, culture is the ideas, customs, and behaviors that describe how things are done around here, right? So culture is basically how things are done around here. And you can have cultures in workplaces or cultures in militaries or cultures in countries or huge parts of the world, like East Asian culture versus Western culture. You can think about that in many different ways, but it's essentially how are things done around here. And so you have culture and identity that reinforce and build each other. And that creates a remarkable sort of social alchemy that enables us as humans to create groups that are far bigger than any others. Now, those groups are formed by human brains, but they as I said, it's more remarkable that we form groups at all, right, than that our groups fall apart. And so our groups will always be falling apart. They will always be changing. They will always be shifting because these incredibly powerful forces of social alchemy that make them can also blow them off course, right? And others can sow discord and so on. And so what's the role of leaders within those groups? So we will always have leaders, and that's partly because our societies will always be hierarchical, right? That's the case in humans and many other animals. We have hierarchical societies. And leaders have two incredibly important sources of power in human societies. One of those sources of power is dominance. So, you see a picture of Vladimir Putin sitting there and all the other people, just before the invasion of Ukraine, and he's sitting in one seat and he has all of his, key chiefs arrayed in a giant row, at the other end of a giant room. And he's like, yeah, tell me, no, you're an idiot, whatever. He's doing all this stuff. I don't even remember that. But there is power, right? Dominance. Another source of power we have as humans is prestige, right? Because humans are incredibly dependent upon learning techniques from other humans. We are teaching and learning animals. That's central to how we can operate, how you and I are speaking now on this incredible machinery that we have to link us electronically, right? I couldn't build it. You couldn't build it. I couldn't even operate it if I hadn't been taught many, many things about how to operate machines. So people have prestige in society, experts. So someone like General MacArthur in World War II had prestige as a military expert. And so we will always have leaders in society. And there are leaders at many, many, many different levels. So you talked there about Ukraine. There were key leaders at different levels. Zelensky was important as the president of Ukraine, but then you had different local leaders that made a huge difference to whether areas of eastern Ukraine went pro-Russian or went or acted against, resisted Russian occupation in 2022. There are always these key leaders all the way down. And how do leaders work? So leaders need self-confidence, right, to take on decisions. And most people don't actually want to take on decisions like that. Leaders need well-calibrated self-confidence. They also need a positive model of the world to give to others, right, so they can achieve some kind of coherent goal. And thirdly, the third key component is they need to be able to communicate that. So you have someone amazing like General Eisenhower, right, in World War II, who then became the US president. And his presidential slogan was very simple and effective, was "I like Ike," right? Good communication is always central in the military or in politics. And you look at someone like Vladimir Putin, for example, and he's a very effective communicator. And that's why I'm not saying he's a good man at all, but he is an effective leader in many ways. And one of the key ways that he operates is by effectively communicating his ideas. And he manages to steer the ever-changing Russian society that is the product of the social alchemy within Russia. And he manages to steer it. And you're absolutely right. That involves speaking to many different leaders at many different levels of many different institutions, many different levels within society. And that will always be the case. And good leaders need to understand that and be able to communicate effectively in all those different ways that really matter.
And I think, to add to that, he understands the mechanics of the deeper psychology of that society. So you have, as you say, you have the quasi-professionalism, as it were, and he before his I think quite obvious cognitive decline, he was relatively fluent. Albeit his language could descend into crudities, but that also very viscerally connects with
That's
the populace.
Effective.
The way Trump does as well,
it's surprise. It's surprising. It's more interesting. I mean, Keir Starmer's, I have a lot of respect for Keir Starmer in many ways, but he's not a man who you're like, oh, that was interesting. I mean, he doesn't say things in a very interesting way. Whereas Donald Trump, he doesn't read very well on the page. But when you actually watch Donald Trump speak, he's actually quite entertaining. He's got good comic timing. It's quite, like he's just
don't
good
try to transcribe.
He's an entertainer.
I've tried to transcribe before, and that doesn't work.
You don't even know where the punctuation goes. But the point is not that. He's a very effective communicator. Like could he? I'm on a podcast right now. One of the things that made me think I'm going to have to do a lot of podcasts for this book is that, right? Podcasts were really important when he won the presidential election last year. Podcasts were important. He did podcasts well. Kamala Harris didn't do podcasts well. Just in the same way, he was a very effective communicator. He was on Twitter. He wouldn't even have got the Republican nomination in for the 2016 election, presidential election, if Twitter hadn't existed and if he wasn't so good at Twitter, right? Because he would never have got the coverage to even win the Republican nomination. So I think effective communication is always going to matter for leaders. And you're absolutely correct. You need to think about all the different ways and groups with which you communicate, and they will require different modes of communication.
And of course, what Putin also signals, which of course is something you don't necessarily really works with us, and I think to an extent Trump also is able to tap into it, but for different reasons. Putin is also able to communicate fear and the will to exert violence. I think that's that interesting bit that we've perhaps forgotten about deterrence, which Putin manages to communicate. It's through the sporadic use of violence, the surgical use of extreme violence. He shows or communicates or signals to not just the population, but more so the elite, that he is willing to enforce his mandate if it's threatened or challenged in any way. And we don't have to do that in our democratic culture. But he manages to balance those two things, looking credible and professional to an internal audience, but also signaling atavistic violence.
I mean, I think during the global war on terror, the British and American governments were quite happy to signal that they were willing to take lethal action against terrorists. So we are in the West, more than willing to do that kind of thing. But I think you're absolutely right. We, and rightly so, do not do it the way they do in Russia, the way Vladimir Putin does. So it's interesting you raised the issue of fear. So, in his quasi-autobiography that he published some years ago now, he describes a famous, and he apparently has brought this up a number of times. He describes a famous that time where he was growing up in a dilapidated Leningrad apartment building, and he was chasing a rat with a stick. He used to enjoy chasing rats. Make of that what you will. And he used to enjoy chasing rats with a stick. And he was like, one day the rat was cornered, and then the rat attacked me. Right? It was no longer me afraid of the. It was no longer the rat afraid of me. It was me afraid of the rat. He understands fear and how to manipulate fear, and that will always be again. So this is one of the reasons, the idea that everything's about stories is that's just one small component of how human brains work. Fear is another crucial component, and we will never get away from fear. So to give you an example, fear is useful. We need fear. If you lose the part of the brain, which is called the amygdala, which is sort of deep within the brain, quite low down, if you lose that, and that does happen in a very rare few cases, you can lose the ability to see fear in others and feel fear yourself. And if you no longer have fear, if you don't have a useful fear system that's helping you, it doesn't mean that you become a fearless criminal who can, just take whatever you want without fear of any consequences, right? Actually, in one of the most famous cases where they've studied that, was an unfortunate lady, and she became the victim of crime. If you don't have fear, you're more likely to be the victim of crime, not some kind of fearless criminal. We need fear. Fear is useful. Fear will always be manipulated. And I think you're absolutely right that somebody like Vladimir Putin probably has a natural gift, unfortunately, for thinking about how to manipulate fear skillfully. But then on the other hand, this is the kind of thing that I would, if the KGB weren't explaining to their people, and he is a former KGB agent, if they weren't explaining to their people how to manipulate fear, then I would be, if I was certainly running the KGB, I'd be like, I'm not sure we're doing a good job here, because this was like, as I understand it, a key component of the thing. But fear will always be with us. We need fear.
Yeah. I think, as you say there, it's not just that Putin is curiously adept at it and he's some sort of aberration. And I think we like to think of it like, oh, if only you get rid of Putin, you'll get rid of all the problems. If you only get rid of Trump, you'll get rid of all the problems. But no, unfortunately, that manipulation of fear is entirely systemic. It's a set of knowledge, a set of tools built up over many generations within the KGB and its architecture. And of course, they were very early to use the idea of psychology and fear. That lovely scientist chap who Pavlov and his dogs.
Pavlov, yeah. Well, they ate Pavlov's dogs. They ate during the siege of Leningrad. They ate Pavlov's dogs. I remember when I came across that, I was like, oh well, I wasn't expecting that. But yeah, so.
But his experiments were far, far darker, and his insights were far darker than the stories were told in science lessons. He was a fairly grotesque character, and his experiments were grotesque. And then I think it's the early version of the KGB that built him an entire institute in even though he was clearly a sort of one of the bourgeoisie, they saw an extraordinary usage of his idea of the psychological in an application of fear and the laying down or coding of behaviors in the brain
Yeah.
under conditions of fear and
I
starvation. I
think
mean, terrible
I think
story.
you're entirely correct,
Yeah.
but I would just say one thing because I do think all of this can sound. I mean, you're on a podcast about war, so and intelligence operations, information operations. So people, it can all sound very pessimistic and but actually, I'm very optimistic. So I think yes, I've literally written a book about war. So obviously, I think war is important. And fear is important, and we need fear. Fear is useful, but also reconciliation is just as human as conflict. And that's really important to remember. So, for example, humans, we have incredible neural machinery higher up in the brain, which is fantastic for understanding others' intentions. What do the others intend to do? And that enables us to collaborate and cooperate with each other in ways that no other animal can. We can cooperate across, there are cleaner fish, small cleaner fish that go into the mouths of bigger fish, and, whatever. Yes, that's cooperation, right, in important ways. But they can't cooperate across a wide range of different contexts, across a wide range of different big fish. If they go into the wrong fish's mouth, they're just going to be eaten, aren't they? So humans can cooperate across a very wide range of different contexts. And that relies on incredible neural machinery. And that incredible neural machinery also enables us to reconcile. So Winston Churchill, for example, his history of World War II was, his long multi-volume history of World War II, right up at the front. One of the key morals of the whole thing, right at the very front, was in victory, magnanimity. And reconciliation, even at the risk, sometimes we will be punished, sometimes we will be, others will deceive us and cheat us. That reconciliation enables so much of what happens in our societies and between societies, and that's also really important. And I think as we understand ourselves better, not just pretending we can all be nice, but understand ourselves better as humans as we really are, we can actually be much more optimistic about ourselves. Not by pretending we're nicer than we are, but by understanding that we have within us, many of us, something really rather remarkable, as well as these other things that can drive us towards war and conflict.
I think
Reconciliation matters too.
you've hit on something there that really gets sort of overlooked, or in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine, it reminds me a little bit of the Pressburger Powell film made in I think 1943-44, which tried to engender some kind of empathy with Germans. Maybe not the best timing, but also perfect timing to do that. And this is a problem, isn't it? Which the Russians are not by default aggressive. They don't come pre-programmed with genocidal aggression. They don't come pre-programmed with their empathy blunted. Or, I mean, you have to learn some of those characteristics. But it seems to me that the Russian regime, this one in particular, but of course other regimes as well in Russia historically, have had to put a lot of effort into hacking human empathy and understanding, trust and cooperation. They have to put a lot of effort into actually destroying the mechanics of what you're talking about there, which is the human tendency is actually to build these things up. So in order to, and the question here is a little more strategic, if you are the aggressor state, do you have to put a lot more effort into building weaponized narratives, mythology, and actually deforming these natural processes of human empathy in order to mount an offensive war as an aggressor? And in fact, as a defender, you don't have to put really that much effort into that because there are other factors there that will be the motivation for fighting.
Um, I think in the modern world, I would tend to say yes, because um, I think as you move to um, uh, as you move to modern societies in which we have so many ways that our societies are structured that now require that rest on cooperation and so on. I think that at quite large levels, and we've become so specialized within our societies that individuals become specialized to different things that is the case. But I do wonder if that has always been the case, and it could change once more. So to give you an example, and in a way, this is agreeing with you. So if you look at, there are always throughout history, there have been groups of people, relatively small groups of people, often in the Middle Ages and so on. It was steppe nomads who would come out, the Mongols, and small groups who would take over enormous territories. Or, for example, the Arabs, who came out of a relatively small group of people who then, yes, they had in that case, they had Islam and so on, and then they literally swept all the way through to all the way across North Africa to Spain, and they went all the way, they were right up and they fought a battle against the Chinese, right? And they obviously get all the way to Indonesia and so on. Or the British Empire that spanned a quarter of the quarter of the world's surface. So I'm not convinced that it's always easier to craft narratives that are. I'm not convinced that it's always easier to craft narratives that better and form people around ideas that are defensive than offensive. I think one of the key differences now, so for example, it was contingent partly on the fact that in World War II, the key offensive states, in that case Germany, who, like Hitler, wanted to go to war and he went to war. There wasn't like a misunderstanding. He clearly wrote it all down in a book and then did it. And he lost. So we learn from that past, we learn from that past era. And of course, now we have nuclear weapons, which means that nobody could occupy Russia. You'd be absolutely mad to try and occupy Moscow because they could the Russians have more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy everyone in the world. So for those reasons, I would say there is nothing really about our brains in many ways that makes it easier to craft defensive and offensive narratives. I just think that is the character of the world we're in now is like that. But I can certainly foresee if there were a number of effective offensives in the near future, people would learn from that, and I worry that could make things quite different.
We've only got time for one sort of question, and I had to bring in cognitive warfare there because we've talked quite a bit in the early part about imagining victory and requiring will. It's not just about machines, and you talk about France and Ukraine's a good example. They were very poorly equipped and divided in 2014, especially, and in fact, the central state had more or less abdicated, or it just wasn't capable of projecting force. It was down to groups of individuals and the so-called civic society that really saved it at that point, and then provided the pressure to build back up sort of more powerful institutions. Even now, civic society plays a huge role. Russia's doing the reverse of this. It seems to understand that actually through cognitive warfare, you can erode not just the will to fight, but you can create dissonant voices or the choir of dissonant voices, which it's very good at, and then use tools like social media to inject narratives of division, despair, lack of unity, and you can inject that into your adversary to sort of pre-weaken them ahead of a kinetic attack. So how does that work with, let's say, sort of the brain's mechanics?
So you are entirely correct. I mean, one important thing to say here is that I think in Western societies, the big problems we face are our own. If we're going to be, if discord is going to occur, the biggest sowers of discord are ourselves. I think that external actors are important, but they're not anywhere near as important as our own internal actions. So I think that's one really important thing, and we need to keep that slightly in perspective and see the bigger picture about that. But yes, what the Russians would term active measures, information operations in more Western parlance. They've always been part of war, and they will always be. They will always leverage effective. They always leverage the same type of things. So things like injustice. Soviet communism, for example. A lot of people really bought into that because they, did not like the clear inequality within their own societies in the 20th century. A lot of people really believed in it. You can also then, as you say, you can then, if you could do it skillfully and well, when you read about how the Soviets did a lot of their information operations, their active measures during the Cold War, they made them interesting and creative. So they cut through. They cleverly mixed reality with fake information, because if you think about it, your brain is sitting there. Every listener, every viewer, you have a brain that's sitting there in a dark, bony skull. How on earth is it connected to reality? How do you know what's real? Right? How do you know anything's real around you? Let alone really. And clearly, if you get things wrong when you're perceiving, you stub your toe. But how do you know what things are real or not real within society? It's very abstract, and keeping in touch with reality is extremely difficult, right? For a brain locked away in its bony vault. And so you can play on that. You can play on, what is real and what is not real, and make people more skeptical and corrosive. And there are lots of practical things you can do with that, and that involves using the latest technologies, so personalized information operations, and there's all sorts of clever and interesting things to do with AI that I discuss in the book. But again, the most important things are ourselves, and one of the most important things we can do is try not to just be clever, but use what I described at earlier on, our amazing abilities in our frontal pole for thinking about our own thinking. So if you travel on the tube now, or you travel on the metro in Washington DC, people are just looking at videos and watching, looking at pictures. What we need to do is we need to use our ability to think about our own thinking. We need to stop and reflect, try and get a better understanding of how the world works, a better tapestry of knowledge with which we make wiser decisions, see the big picture about ourselves and the world. And so that's what wisdom is. That's why wisdom isn't just being clever. Wisdom, right, and you could think about this from ancient Greece, or ancient China, right? Self-reflection is central to wisdom. So wisdom is seeing the bigger picture about ourselves in the world so that we can make wiser choices that help us achieve our goals, better choices that help us achieve our goals. And we can do that in a way that no other animal can. It's like that model I described earlier on, which like a fruit fly or a mouse has. We have the incredible ability to reach in and interrogate our own model, say, are we chasing the right goal here? Is this true? How certain am I that what I'm reading on the internet is actually correct or not? Is it infallible? No. Is it amazing? Yes. And I think that, and also we can all enhance it in ourselves. I obviously discussed that in the book. And I think that our incredible capacity for self-knowledge about ourselves as individuals and about ourselves as humans in society, and about how humans really are in society, I think that self-knowledge can really help us meet this challenge of disinformation, meet this challenge of sowing discord, and can help us build a more peaceful world.
Something of a perfect storm, haven't we? As you say, the focus on social media, on pictures rather than maybe abstract analytical thought. And then for those who might have engaged in that, there's a tendency to defer that process of thinking to AI that produces the pot noodle answer, as it were, instant
Very nice.
intelligence, which is
Yeah.
very dangerous, very dangerous indeed. Nick, it's been absolutely fabulous speaking. I think I could probably fire a billion more questions at you and create a dozen more episodes, and we still wouldn't have even got near the bottom of the barrel. But for today, though, it's an immense pleasure. I strongly recommend people to look up the book. It is absolutely thrilling. There's so much food for thought in there, and I think that kind of material is essential to navigate the dangerous times that we find ourselves living in. For today, though, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on, Jonathan.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work, the very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend Operator Starsky says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.